just to jump in, the goal to understand capital reserve studies, understand how they're done, what the application of one is, what the benefit is. And the reality is, or I guess a way of thinking of it is, capital reserve studies are a reality check, would be a good way to put it. One of the epiphanies that we've had at club benchmarking in the last year, I do a lot of board presentations, as folks on the webinar may know. And recently, what I say when I do these, and it's absolutely true, our 9th birthday is Sunday, by the way. The company started on April 1st, 2009. And we've studied a lot of data over that period of time. But personally, I've learned more in the last year about finances in clubs than I did in the previous 8 years. And I mean that. And one of the key central piece of that learning, or that last year, that epiphany, it's really an epiphany that's occurred, is how important the capital ledger and the balance sheet are in a club, and how little, frankly, we focus on them in the boardroom of the club. We really are on a mission now to help clubs lift their focus, I would say, from the income statement and the operating ledger to the capital ledger and the balance sheet. And we'll get into some of the reasons that we've come to that conclusion very shortly. But when you think about fiduciary duty in the boardroom of a private member-owned club, and you look at different state laws regarding what a fiduciary has to do in terms of the organization for which they act as a fiduciary, in Texas state law, one of the statutory requirements is literally an accurate accounting of all assets. And if you look at a club's balance sheet, which we will in a minute, 80% of the assets in the average club end up on one line item of the balance sheet. And that line item is the net value, the net book value of the property, plant, and equipment at the club. And the central premise of a capital reserve study is literally doing that accounting of every physical asset that the club has. So to a point, and I want to emphasize, I don't want to be dramatic, but I want to emphasize it. We believe every club in the country should have a capital reserve study in hand. Our estimate is that 10% or less do. And the reality is that you can't raise to the level of being a fiduciary for a club if you do not have that in hand. Whether it comes from us or someone else, I don't care. The point is, you need one. And you can't meet the obligations that exist without it. Some folks may be familiar with our financial insight model. It really has two components. One is the income statement. On the income statement, there's two ledgers. There's the operating ledger and the capital ledger. The focus of this is the capital ledger. The other component of the model is the balance sheet. And as I said earlier, this is data we've been gathering now over the last year. We have about 350 clubs where we've analyzed the balance sheet now. Most of what we had done through last year was more income statement focused. And this is the learning and the epiphany that's occurred. I won't show you the data that proves this, but the data proves this. The income statement is not a financial engine in a club. The income statement is literally a proxy or manifestation of delivering services and amenities to members. We consume the income statement as members of clubs. It does not persist for the vast majority of clubs financially over time. The only thing that persists financially over time in clubs is the balance sheet. And every balance sheet has assets and liabilities and equity. Equity is the money that comes from members over time. Liability is the money that's come from others over time, mainly in clubs, that's banks, in the form of debt. And assets is the money that the club has, the financial value, not just money and cash, but the financial value a club has at a point in time, typically the end of the year is what we look at. And 80% of the assets, as I said earlier, end up on one line item, and that is the after depreciated value of the property, plant, and equipment that the club owns. So it's a very important number. It is literally 80% of the value of the club. We talk about net worth over time, and the reason that we have, and I hope folks on this webinar have sent us their net worth over time data for the last 10 or 12 years. We've got that now from about 350 clubs. And what we found is this: half the clubs, the net worth, meaning the members' equity, which is, I'm going to go back a slide, 70% of the value of the club, is declining in real terms, meaning it's not keeping up with inflation. So that's for 50% of the clubs in the country. That net worth is decreasing over the last 10 to 12 years. And the reason that's important is because it's reflected, 80% of that's reflected on the other side of the balance sheet in the property, plant, and equipment. And if the net worth of a club is going down, then the value of the property, plant, and equipment is going down. And it should be increasing, not decreasing. And if it's decreasing, what's happening is the assets are becoming more and more depleted. We think that a club needs to generate growth in net worth of at least 3.5% a year in order to move forward in a consistent manner. And the reason for that is, first off, net worth only grows if your capital income is greater than your depreciation expense. If it's less than the depreciation expense, the net worth goes down. But depreciation isn't the accurate proxy for capital needs that we think it might be. It's actually a backward-looking number. It's a historical cost, not a current cost. So you have to account for inflation. Paul will address this when he does his segment of the webinar. But every club, it would be safe to say, every club in the country has assets that are in use that are fully depreciated. So when you look at the depreciation expense, it doesn't reflect those assets, and those assets will eventually need to be replaced. And then finally, there's some issues which Paul will address in terms of the accuracy of the fixed asset schedule. We have done, Paul in club benchmarking now, he's part of our team, have done 160 different clubs capital reserve studies in the last several years. And if you look at the fixed asset schedule and you do the physical inventory of assets, which is what we do when we do a study, it can be up to a 30% gap between reality, meaning the physical inventory, and the accounting of that, which is manifested in the fixed asset schedule. It's a critical point. So for those reasons, depreciation expense is not an accurate accounting of what we need for capital. And for that reason, we believe that the net worth, it's not enough to keep flat, meaning meet depreciation expense. It's actually got to be higher, and our estimate is 3.5% higher. Just I'm going to segue into Paul now, but to set this up and really drive home how important this point is. And, you know, it's really a journey, as you know, we're on, and this is the epiphany we've had in the last year. If you look at two different clubs, just as an example, one was built 50 years ago, it cost $3 million to build it. If you look at their balance sheet, the gross property, plant, and equipment is $3 million. That's what they paid or invested when they built the club. Let's say that club hasn't reinvested one penny. If you looked at their accumulated depreciation, it would be $3 million. And their net property, plant, and equipment, which is the amount it's worth on paper after depreciation, would be 0. So the net property, plant, and equipment to gross ratio would be 0%. On the other end of the spectrum, let's say a club opened up yesterday. It cost $30 million to build. Obviously, it's more expensive today than it was 50 years ago. And they haven't started operating yet. Their gross property, plant, and equipment is $30 million. It's excluding land. We'll make that point shortly. The accumulated depreciation is 0 because we haven't depreciated anything yet. We haven't operated. So the net property, plant, and equipment is what it costs to build. It's $30 million. That net to gross ratio is 100%. Every club in the country or in North America, I know we have folks from Canada on the webinar, every club, the net to gross ratio is going to fall somewhere between 0 and 100%. If you're at 0%, the club is completely worn and depleted. everything is fully depreciated and it looks like a junkyard or a museum, best case a museum. If it's 100%, everything is brand new and nothing has been depreciated. That frames the spectrum. This shows the ratio for 350 real clubs. These clubs exist. We can get this data very easily off of the 990 that's filed from not-for-profit member-owned clubs. It's filed publicly. In the range of the 350 clubs, that ratio, it's not 0 to 100. It's 15 to 80. So I've had the fortune or opportunity of being in the club within the last 2 months, the club that's the 15% club, and I was in the club that's the 80% club. The 80% club 18 months ago tore down their clubhouse and rebuilt a huge new, brand new, beautiful $25 million clubhouse. So that clubhouse is on the books for $25 million gross PP&E, accumulated depreciation is $25 million, and the net zero. So the clubhouse is 100% ratio. But that club also has cart paths. It has a golf course maintenance barn like every club. It has a cart barn. It has a pool. It has a parking lot. All of those things weren't updated. So even though they have that new, beautiful clubhouse, they still don't have a brand new quote-unquote club because those other items are close to fully depreciated or well into their depreciated life. But 80% would represent, at this point, 350 clubs, probably as fresh as it would be. 15%, that club I've been in as well, and we have to say it's the opposite. When you walk into that club, it's very worn out. It's frankly depleted. Before you get to the clubhouse entrance, which you can see immediately, you actually have to drive through a few potholes in the parking lot because the parking lot hasn't been resurfaced in 30 years. So every club's going to fall somewhere on this spectrum. And if the median for the industry is 48%, this ratio, every club on this call could calculate this ratio off of their last audited financial statement. It literally, this is like, we always look for quick ratios. This one takes 3 minutes to calculate. Usually you have to go to a note in the financial statements because the balance sheet typically only shows net property, plant, and equipment. And to get the gross, you got to go to the note. But every audited statement will have that note. And the only caveat is you have to exclude land from the calculation because land is not depreciated. So you exclude it from the net and the gross. And you make that calculation. If you're below the median, or the further to the left you go, the further below the median of 48% you are, the more worn and depleted your assets are. And the further to the right you are, the fresher and more up-to-date your physical plant is. We don't know yet. We're in the process of doing a rigorous analysis. We can't tell you, quote unquote, what the right number is. I can tell you this. I'm in 3 or 4 clubs a week, and I've been in clubs where the ratio is 53%, and frankly, it looks a little worn. So it does have something to do with where the money has been invested. Some assets have more of an aesthetic effect than others, like an irrigation system, you don't see it, but furniture, fixture, and equipment, you see it. And so it does matter where the investments have been recently, but suffice it to say, everyone should know what their ratio is. And then when Paul talks about capital reserve studies, that's the only way to really get a sense of where it should be. And then the other factor, if you just look at, normalize it, look at 18-hole facilities. This is to give you the range. This is 350 clubs again. The net value of property, plant, and equipment for the clubs that we've gathered this data ranges from $333,000 to $60 million. So these are all 18-hole country clubs, and the median's $10.5 million. Now, can you imagine a club, 18-hole country club, pool, couple of tennis courts, parking lot, clubhouse, irrigation system, cart barn, course maintenance equipment, HVAC equipment, everything. And on paper, its current value is $333,000. Clearly, that club needs more capital. So the key is every club has a footprint. If you were to look at the footprint and say, how much would we need to invest to make that footprint fresh and up to date? That's what a capital reserve study is. And that's how you quantify the gap between what your investment is and what it should be. And Paul's going to take it from there and give us some insight on how we do capital reserve studies and what the effect of it is.
Great. Thank you, Ray. We are going to segue a little bit into solving some of these issues that Ray has identified, and undoubtedly there's quite a few gears going in the audience's minds right now about how to solve these problems. We suggest, and as Ray introduced, one of the ways to solve this evaluation is the documentation of a capital reserve study. Very simply, the capital reserve study documents, organizes, and prioritizes all of your capital repair and replacement expenditures over the next 20 years. We particularly use a metric of any asset that of a current replacement value of $2,500 and greater, and a 3-year life and greater should be evaluated for future capital expenditures. So we're going to get a little bit into the weeds with a detailed documentation of a typical example, but start thinking about how much your own club has in terms of the assets that would fall under that metric. So remember, we inventory, document, organize, and help prioritize. Organization is key in all the clubs for understanding clearly all of the assets that should be included. Prioritization, as Ray mentioned, if we're at that 48% metric, we may be looking a little tired, and there may be some hard decisions to be made about how to spend very tight capital. The capital reserve study we suggest should have a 20-year time frame. And I'm often asked, well, why 20 years? Why is that an important metric? The reason for that is shown on the 2 pictures to the left. If you've been out to your irrigation system for your golf course and you see these tall sentinels here, these are your very expensive high-capacity irrigation pumps and motors. They are extremely expensive to replace. They have generally a useful life of 20 to 25 years. So even if they're brand new, it is something that the club should be aware of and plan for, but potentially in the later years of the study. Below that is a very unsexy back of the house, fix it when it breaks, makeup air unit. If you've been up on your flat roof, this essential element helps your air conditioning system. Out of sight, out of mind, but if it breaks in July and you have a 300-person wedding, that's a problem. So we want to have that evaluated as well. And once again, any asset with the $2,500 and greater and a 3-year useful life and greater is included within your study. So everyone has a grill, or a mixed grill, or a members grill, however you want to term it. We all have a communal large dining area. The capital reserve study almost literally tears this room apart in terms of the components that fall within that criteria. For example, there's a certain amount of dining chair and table, a certain amount of bar cabinetry, bar stools, carpeting, window treatments, light fixtures, emergency or what we call life safety devices. This happens to be an absolutely stunning room that was recently redone in a club in the South Carolina area. And I've seen it before, and the club did this amazing job of just rehabbing this room in 2016. All right, so it's great. It's brand new right now. But as Ray pointed out, over time, wear and tear is going to make things necessary for planning for those replacements. Now, not every component within this example is going to have a similar useful life based on A, quality of initial purchase, quality of installation, use and maintenance, and storage practices. We all have dining chairs and tables that have been moved around multiple times during a day, several times during a week, and they get banged up. You have to be careful that this is a member touch area that really needs to be top notch. Bar cabinetry, wear and tear, water exposure, use, wear and tear, again, it has a little bit longer life. Bar stools, a little bit shorter than dining because they get knocked around as well. Carpet has a variable useful life, again, because of initial quality. You're not going to spend a great deal of money in the administrative offices, but you will be spending more money in dining, and that speaks to their useful lives. Window blinds are often coordinated in a general interior renovation. Life fixtures, life safety devices generally are a little bit longer, closer to the 20-year functional mark. And I want to emphasize function rather than aesthetics. Many clubs will take down a room to refresh the aesthetics. So there's a balance in our studies between desired aesthetics and also actual physical useful lives. Similar to variable useful lives, we have variable asset replacement values. And we're going to get into the depreciation schedule a little bit more, but we utilize the depreciation schedule to understand what the club has been most comfortably spending for replacement of a certain asset. You can spend $450 for an inexpensive dining chair that may last you 8 years. You can spend $1,600 for a custom dining chair that will be an heirloom piece. And so the example here just shows that we need to research and understand what the club has reasonably spent in the past, bring that up to a 2018 present value, and understand that that is a comfortable basis for projecting future costs. So pause for a moment and just mentally walk through your own club. If you walk through the kitchen, mechanical spaces, your golf course, fitness, your spa, think about all those FF&E and mechanical systems that fall within this criteria. So we would suggest in determining this information that accuracy and expertise is not an option. In many situations, clubs will try to conduct an internal reserve study. I applaud that effort, but frankly, there are situations where there are time limitations, knowledge limitations, and the ability to really produce an accurate reserve study is often beyond the scope of your executive staff's knowledge. So we want to emphasize that there is a precise analysis of every asset, location, capacity, age of installation, and accurate cost estimations. We use several different databases. One is a national contractor database, which you're familiar with, RS Means, along with 150 clubs in our data metric base, and also our professional experience working with clubs for almost 20 years nationwide. So we draw upon your individual resources of cost information, our professional database, and our professional experience to help drill down the best cost estimate possible. Now this graphic is going to be intentionally a little bit difficult to look at, but it does show you the level of detail that we gather together, and this is an example of what we call clubhouse building services, basically mechanical services. And we identify the quantity, the location, when it was installed, a typical asset service life based on quality of installation, quality of preventive maintenance. Then we identify its current 2018 replacement value, and then if it's a multiple replacement, that multiple value. And then because in the last light blue column, almost in the middle of the screen at the top there, because replacements can happen more than once in the 20-year time frame of the study, we have the future aggregate replacement value. Now, Ray touched on the effect of inflation a little bit, and luckily inflation has been fairly quiet for 16 and 17 and most likely for 2018. So we do not use a standard CPI, which is volatile because of energy and food prices. We use basically about 3.8% rate of inflation, not for the first few years, because historically it's only been 1 to 1.7%. We use a 3.8 after, say, 2019 for the balance of the study. We like to be conservative with the inflation rate, but we all recognize in the past few years, inflation has not been as horrible as it has been in the early 70s and mid 70s. So this is a typical example redacted from a recent client, and again illustrates the level of detail that should be expressed within your capital reserve study. Ray also touched on depreciation evaluation versus the capital reserve study. And this is a great quote from my great friend, Mark Beto, who is the general manager at Myers Park in Charlotte. Mark and I have worked together on 4 different occasions and recently completed his study for that great club in Charlotte. Mark states that the schedules can satisfy the necessary accounting and tax functions, but they are not effective as planning tools for understanding capital needs. Remember Ray's comment about being fully depreciated. Sure, that's on the schedule, but it's not an effective means of understanding when the capital for its replacement is going to be necessary. Further, there are really big differences between an asset's depreciable useful life and actual useful life. One example, a large capacity rough mower. It may be depreciated on the schedule at 7 years, but you have a mechanic that's been there 20 years, he's worth his weight in gold. He might stretch that to 8, 9, or 10 years. So understanding that actual useful life is part of our on-site interview process with the key executive staff. As Ray mentioned, reliance on the depreciation schedule is risky because in our investigation when we're on site and conducting the staff interviews and our quantification, thinking back to that grill example slide, not everything is falling on the depreciation schedule, and we often find very significant variances that cause concern. Now, here's a graphic that really illustrates this. On the left is a broad, these are both real examples, we did not make these up. On the left is actually a depreciation schedule that was returned to us as part of our investigation for finances. Take a look at the last 5 or 6 line items. Broad numbers, 2010 additions, 2011 additions. Okay, they identified the pump house, thank you. But the line above is another broad category. This does not help anybody in terms of the broad, vague information. On the right-hand side is the best one I've ever seen. This is with Angie Stewart of Country Club of Virginia. Country Club of Virginia is a small city broken up into 2 different campuses. So Angie has identified which campus it falls in, the exact date it was purchased, a great description down to the model number on this, and down to the penny, a purchase amount for this as well. So this is really a great depreciation schedule, and there are probably a lot of heads shaking in the audience right now with a knowing smile of we're kind of on the left and we're kind of on the right. Let's move closer to the right-hand example. This is a quote from my great friend Mitch Stump of the Club Tax Network. Mitch is the tax expert in all club taxation issues. If you don't know him, get to know him because he's the greatest guy to pick up the phone, answer a question, and he'll always give you the right answer. In certain states, personal property tax, it can be taxed by the county, and because of Ray's citation of how the variances of depreciation schedules happen, that can counteract the county's taxation documents. So it's often necessary to really look at what's been disposed so that you're not creating unnecessary taxation on the club. What we do next is understanding with the club the integration of the depreciation schedule with the finished capital reserve study. We've recently introduced the GL or depreciation expense classification so that we want the capital expenditure part of the study to really be a live living document that demonstrates and integrates with your known trusted information with what we find in the actual on-site inspection. So that's a great value add as you add assets, as you dispose of assets, you can do a cross-check and really make things as accurate as absolutely possible. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Ray because the question is, Paul, great information, the study is fantastic, it's the level of detail that we want, but the numbers may be a little daunting. So once it's studied, or excuse me, once it's completed, I'm always asked, how do we compare with our other clubs? How do we compare with our local competition? How do we compare nationally? And how do we compare based on our revenues? So I'm going to turn that back over to Ray, and he's going to walk us through the next slides to illustrate that information.
Thank you, Paul.
Hold on just a moment, please. We lost audio for a second.
Hello. Yes, I hope we're back. I don't know what happened. We have a new phone system in our office, and something just glitched. But as we say, you have to be flexible. So when I lost the audience, I was just kind of refreshing what we're doing here. But the first part of this webinar shows the ratios and KPIs and kind of the context for why a capital reserve study is so critical. Paul went through in detail, the quality and the detail of the data that relates to doing a capital reserve study in the proper manner, and that's a critical point. And this third part, what we're going to delve into is it's not just enough to do a capital reserve study. It's kind of like a strategic plan. There's many organizations that do strategic plans and they end up in someone's desk drawer, but they don't have an impact on the organization. A real strategic plan has to change the way the organization functions. Otherwise, there's no need to do it. It has to change something. And a capital reserve study is no different. It really needs to change the way the club operates in terms of, frankly, its thinking, how important capital is in the running of a club, how it manages capital, how it budgets for capital, how it accounts for capital. So this part of the presentation is about applying the capital reserve study. So one thing to begin with is we do ask clubs, do you have a capital reserve fund? And 2/3 of the clubs answered yes to that question. 1/3 say no. One of the things we're going to be analyzing in great detail over the next several months, now that we've combined forces with Paul and we have all of our data and all of his data, but there's a really great question that we get asked, and frankly, we can't answer it because we don't know yet, but we're going to figure it out, and that is, what is the right amount in a capital reserve fund? We've done some thinking on it, but this is the data that we gather. This is what clubs have in their funds. We broke the industry into 3 simple buckets: less than $5 million in revenue, 5 to 10, and over 10. And you can see the 25th percentile, the median, and the 75th. And there's an obvious takeaway from this slide, which is there is tremendous variation in the amount of reserves that clubs have on hand for capital. I think the more we focus and the more clubs can focus on capital reserve studies and understanding the true capital needs, the more likely it is that they'll begin to aggregate and accumulate the reserves necessary to meet those needs. In the absence of accounting the needs precisely, it's hard to accumulate the money because no one's focused on it. Another way of looking at it, there is a normalizing function. It has somewhat to do with scale, so it's just operating revenue. There is a pretty tight relationship between operating revenue and the footprint of a club. If a club has a large footprint, Paul mentioned CCV earlier, Country Club of Virginia, a 2-campus club, very large club, very big footprint, lots of operating revenue. Smaller clubs, maybe golf-only clubs, less revenue. So the revenue kind of ties to the footprint, but the capital investment would track. So if you just look at capital investment as a percentage of operating revenue, it's a nice way to think in terms of what the needs of the footprint are, a given footprint. And you can see the distribution here across the same segmentation of the industry. The takeaway here, again, 2 points. One, there's great variation in any one segment. So in the small segment, a quarter of the clubs invested 2% or less of the capital, of the operating revenue. We believe that a quarter of the clubs in the country are in severe financial distress. The reason they're in that distress is they are not generating the capital necessary. Clearly, that's that lower quartile. Then in the upper quartile, the 75th percentile, you can see clubs are generating relatively significant amounts of capital. So we believe that the break point is at 10%. Now, that doesn't mean every club, it's same for every club, but roughly the threshold is 10% of your operating revenue. You have to be at least investing at least 10%, and that's much more oriented towards repair and replacement than adding new physical assets. So clubs that are below 10% are probably not investing what they need. That's a very easy calculation to do as well. It takes literally 30 seconds. And then finally, debt does play into this. So we just wanted to address that. This is the distribution of debt across the various industry segments. You know, for a club that's over 10 million in revenue, 130,000 in debt is basically zero. Statistically, it says 130, but it's pretty much zero. So if you looked at the industry as a whole, a quarter of the clubs in the country don't have debt. One of the things that we wonder about is whether it is appropriate for a club to have debt. I'll just say this. The better clubs are at planning for the future, the better clubs are for planning for the future, using a capital reserve study and planning capital needs and predicting and projecting and forecasting capital resources, the less debt they'll have. The debt, much of the debt that exists in the industry, unfortunately, is what we would call reactive debt. It's debt that came into place to meet repair and replacement capital investment, and that's not a good thing. And then there's another piece of this puzzle that we're beginning to address. We have Eric Gregory, for those who are on the West Coast. He's joined our team recently as well, and he's very much adept and expert at capital strategies modeling. So ultimately, the real application of a capital reserve study isn't to just assess what the needs are. It's what I just said. It's to use the needs assessment to determine how you will generate the resources to meet the needs. And so we call that capital strategies modeling. And it's like anything, this is just an eye into a model that we have developed that we use. But the point of it is that modeling is an ongoing process. It doesn't end, it's continuous. And it's a really critical part of the application of a reserve study. It takes into account all of the needs defined by the study, but it also takes into account the variables that relate to generating the resources. Member counts, initiation fee incomes, whether the club has an operating deficit or not, which is consuming some of the capital. And then on top of all those baselines, you want to do sensitivity analysis. What happens if our member count goes up 10%? What happens if it goes down 10%? What happens if our initiation fee goes up 20%? What happens if it goes down 20%? That modeling in those scenarios, in that sensitivity analysis, are all a crucial part of applying the capital reserve study in the real world. And then Paul's going to take us to the finish line. And I forgot to mention, by the way, at the outset, we're happy to take questions. Terry Finan's with us as well, and so if anyone has any questions, please let us know, and we'll answer it as quickly as we can. Good.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Now that we've understood what the capital reserve study can accomplish as the first step in understanding how we get to solving these financial issues, there are other integrations with current club planning efforts that we're just going to explore very briefly for the remainder of the session. Probably the most important or most beneficial for your executive staff and frankly your finance committee and your overall board is the budget formation process. We're going to take a look at how the CRS really streamlines that process for everyone, how it might integrate with master plan or architectural activities. Since '08, everybody's kind of put the clamp on capital, and a lot of clubs are playing catch up, but others are now working into a master plan and architectural projects nationwide to really not only catch up, but as Ray said, almost aspirational improvements that will affect the overall capital plan. And that also dovetails into the major efforts now of strategic planning. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about developer transition from developer control to the membership board. So putting the capital reserve study in action, as I've mentioned, strategic planning remains the buzz phrase for the industry, and many clubs are looking at dated facilities, expanding their existing facilities, or in some situations, building completely new facilities to eliminate operational inefficiencies or, frankly, deterioration that has been let go too far. In the financial planning column, the annual budget process is made far more easy by the CRS because if you look at the first 5 years, your executive staff can understand what's coming down the line, and you can A, B, C prioritize what is likely or what should be expended for capital expenditures. The study also, because of that 20-year time frame, informs long-term capital strategies. So your LRP board can really understand where the club needs to be in X years, 10 years out, 15 years, 20 years out. Even if you have a 7 or 8-year-old irrigation system, that $2 million project has to be thought of as it impacts the long-term thinking for the club. And as Ray mentioned, the capital reserve study is very much, and so is the CSM, the modeling program, is very much a living document and subject to a lot of factors, including we need to understand the risk analysis impact and also the sensitivity of actual financial impacts within the overall picture. We always consider that the capital reserve study is really your foundation, a financial foundation for the entire club. Delving a little bit into a quote from my friend again, Mark Beto, for budget process. Basically, it has streamlined the process for everybody, department managers, the controller, your GM, and your board of directors. It makes everyone's life a lot easier, especially if you keep it as a living document to really take a pulse of your current and your future capital needs. And as I mentioned in the discussion on depreciation schedule, asset disposition. For master planning, we've been engaged with several clubs that are, well, Paul, we want to do a capital reserve study, but we're just in the middle of a master plan. And I'm often asked, well, when should we do the capital reserve study? That answer is any time in the process of a master plan effort. Why is that? Because A, you really need to know your existing assets and your financial obligation to those assets before we call the architect and have fun with these beautiful renderings and drawings to show where the club and that aspirational capital expenditure may fall. This is an actual example I've worked on in Minnesota that showed expansion of tennis on the left-hand side of the graphic. In the middle, that pink rectangle is a new member activity center to answer fitness desires. The next square or rectangle to the right would be a new lap pool with a zero-entry kiddie pool. And the last one would be renovation or reorganization of a horrible parking lot area. And then the last pink one on the right would be the addition of outdoor dining and a general renovation to the clubhouse. So the capital reserve study really informed where the club can go with this fun idea, but as Ray said, how much debt should the club take on or could take on without strangling day-to-day operations and day-to-day finances. And this is just a small example for those down in southwest coast of Florida. This is an example from Mediterra's master planning, and my friend John Cerny, who was their architect. John is a big fan of capital reserve studies, and here's a great quote. It's integral to inform the leaders of all the financial requirements, coming back to Ray's point of fiduciary responsibility, needed to keep our recent Florida clients in line while they're contemplating these intensive expansions. That is really the core of how you do a proper long-range plan for any private club. Now, coming into strategic planning, Rick Bayless, for those of you on the southeast coast of Florida, are familiar with Lost Tree. The upper photograph is that poor 1961 clubhouse that operationally was just impossible to deal with. And we were brought in to do a capital reserve study to understand what it would cost to really keep this 1961 clubhouse up and running. And the answer was quite surprising. It almost was the same value of this beautiful new clubhouse, properly laid out, properly constructed, and beautifully finished at Lost Tree. It is now the gem of the Palm Beach Garden area. And lastly, my good friend Robin Stoll, who is the touchstone for any legal issues within the club industry. Robin is the best at transitioning from a developer-owned club into the membership ownership structure. And she quotes that these are essential tools during the transition for education of the new board members, those brave souls that are volunteering to run a brand new club, and also educating them to really understand how to fulfill their new fiduciary responsibility. So those four examples really do show that once you've completed your capital reserve study, working it into Eric's modeling program, focusing back onto Ray's points of where you fall in that 48% median, how it integrates into further larger products and services that continue to guarantee the health of your club.
I think that'll wrap it up. We would love to see if there's any questions. We do have a few questions. The first one is, do you incorporate a contingency fund along with the asset plan? And if so, how much percentage of revenue?
Rusty, that's a great question. In the really complex little graphic that we had, it did not show, but we typically include a budgetary contingency of either 5, 7.5, or 10% of each annual expected capital expenditures. The reason for that is that there will always be discretionary actual selections of, say, grades of carpet, colors of window treatments, or different models of kitchen equipment or golf course equipment. So the board has to have that type of financial flexibility.
The next question revolves around, in terms of a master plan, understanding what facilities will attract new members, especially millennials. I would add to that, I know we talk a lot about millennials. Our view is it's Generation X. That's the next group of, the baby boomers have driven clubs to where they are. They age out and retire. The people filling the seats of baby boomers now in clubs are Generation X. The club joining age is between 35 and 50 typically. We just did a survey of a couple of hundred people that have joined the club in the last 3 years. The average age of that group was 42. But whether it's millennials or Generation X, those, to the point, the question that it's not golf necessarily that attracts new members. It's other family activities or broader services and amenities. If we can prove that point, the data in our database shows conclusively that the broader the services and amenities a club offers, the less golf-centric it is, the higher the member count and the higher the initiation fee. So that is absolutely the case. And then one other point there, the exercise that we've done, and I asked that person who asked that or made that point, if we don't have your net worth over time, we'd love to get it because it's a key insight into this. The key point, as you stated, is if you make an investment in services and amenities, even though many clubs are not for profit, they still have to make a return on investment. You can't make financial investments without getting something back for it. So it's a critical point. The metric that shows whether or not that has succeeded at a particular club over time is the net worth over time measure, which we can benchmark for you. That's a free service we provide for any club. So please send us that data or request that we send you the template for that data.
Our next question is, how do we address roofing, painting, and corrosion control? I think somebody's in a caustic ocean environment within the capital reserve study. Thomas, that's a great question. We take a look at your R&M repair schedules, and also in our conversation on site with your facility supervisor, understand how you've been approaching this, and we may have suggestions or a different approach in terms of how to maybe particularly be a little bit more aggressive on capital maintenance to extend the useful life of the eventual capital replacement. Next question is from regarding how often it should be updated. That's a great question. I did not address that as yet. Once the study is in place, it's highly variable from club to club. If we find that a club is expending, for example, 38% of all of their 20-year capital expenditures in the next 5 years, we want to hear from that club every single year so that we can keep all of those expenditures decided upon by the board in lockstep, which may affect subsequent near-term years. So very important. However, if the club is only averaging 25% in each of the 4 5-year segments of the study, then probably every 3 to 4 years.
We've got a couple more questions.
Yep, we're just scrolling down on those. We'll get to them in just a second.
One of them was, what's the range of a price?
Yeah, we're going to come to that. Okay.
Hold up.
Can you?
So the range of pricing, typically someplace, I would say, Paul, between 15 and 30K, depending obviously on the footprint of the club again, how large the club is.
Absolutely. A typical clubhouse, say 4 tennis courts, a pool or aquatics facility, maybe a separate fitness building, and an 18-hole golf course with all the amenities, generally is in the high teens, probably 18 to 20. And if you have a multi-campus situation, then obviously it does increase because of that additional assets to be included. So, but again, if you would like any additional information, the email is crs@clubbenchmarking.com. We'd be more than happy to answer any further questions. Do we have a few more minutes? All right, Terry's giving me a few more minutes to run through. On the golf course, do you include just bunkers in the CRS, tee boxes or greens, or the latter, just land? Gary, no, absolutely. We tear apart the course. We will be looking at grass quality, drainage, green speeds, pin location, collars, all the grass quality that would affect the member experience. We also extend to the bunkers. Are they draining correctly? Do we have the proper depth of sand? Do we have any sort of liner that would extend the useful life of the bunkers? Are the collars correct? How are the membership reacting to the playing conditions for the bunkers? Tees are the same situation. Obviously, they're much less complicated, but they better be flat, they better be square. So those are definitely included within the capital reserve study.
That's it. Okay, well, thank you very much. We will say next month, to continue the theme, the webinar is going to focus on the application in detail, the application of the study in terms of capital strategies, modeling, and Eric Gregory will be doing that for us. So we appreciate everyone participating. Please feel free to email us any other questions you might have, and we will archive the webinar on our website for future use of review. And but as everyone I think knows, here at Club Benchmarking, we aim to be very service oriented. And so if you have any questions, any needs, whether you subscribe or don't subscribe, please feel free to reach out and we'll do whatever we can to help you. And have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.